Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Are you struggling with getting sharp photos? Or are you interested in exploring all the creative opportunities that shutter speed affords, like creating intentional blur in your photos or freezing fast action? In this video, I'm going to tell you how shutter speed works, how it affects your exposure, and how to use it creatively to get photos like this and this. If you stay till the end, I'll show you a trick on how to use shutter speed to take Milky Way photos like this, this, and this. The center one has an added trick in it. Can you spot it? My name is Simon D'Entremont. I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for wildlife and nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. Let's start off with what shutter speed is. It's technically the length of time that your camera sensor is exposed to light. That is, the shutter opens and closes, and the length of time between those two is your shutter speed. That being said, newer cameras with electronic shutters can simulate the same effect by reading the amount of light captured in a certain amount of time. Now let's have a look at what shutter speed can control or do on your camera. The first is control your exposure. Along with ISO and aperture, it's one of the three main settings on your camera to control the brightness of your photo. I have videos on those two already if you want to check those out. So let's look in more detail how shutter speed does this. Here is a 1/2 second exposure, followed by a 1/50th of a second exposure. In this case, note that the 1/2 second exposure is 25 times longer than the 1/50th of a second exposure and leads to a brighter photo. So there's an inverse relationship between the brightness of your photo and your shutter speed. In this demonstration, the faster I set my shutter speed, the darker the image will become. The slower I set my shutter speed, the brighter the image will become. When shooting in manual, if your image is too dark, lower the shutter speed to brighten your exposure. If the image is too bright, increase the shutter speed to darken your exposure. For subjects that don't move, this is a great way of fine-tuning your exposure to be just right. Along with changing your exposure, one of the fundamental settings in your camera is making sure you have enough shutter speed to freeze the action and make sure your photos are sharp. So where to start? How much shutter speed do you need to freeze the action? For objects that aren't moving, a great place to start is the fraction 1 over your focal length to determine your shutter speed. So a 50mm lens, you can shoot it at 1/50th of a second, or a 300mm lens, 1/300th of a second. Of course, if you have an image stabilized sensor or a really good technique, you can cheat on this and get away with a bit less. But if your shutter speed is too slow, your subject can move while the shutter is open, causing blur in your image. The result of this is that the faster your subject is moving, the more shutter speed you need to freeze it. So while I can freeze someone standing around at 1/50th or 1/100th of a second, I might need 1/500th of a second for someone moving around or on a bicycle, 1/1000th of a second for sports or moving pets, 1/2500th of a second for fast flying birds, and 1/4000th of a second to freeze the wings on a hummingbird. The longer the focal length lens you have, the faster the apparent motion of things through the field of view. So you need more shutter speed as you increase the focal length, and when you have wider lenses with a shorter focal length, you can get away with less because the apparent motion through the field of view is slower. Because having longer focal lengths and faster action increase the risk of having a blurry image due to your subject moving in the frame, take plenty of photos. This will increase the odds that some of them are sharp. One of the coolest effects using shutter speed is the opposite of freezing the action, and that's creating intentional blur. You'll often need a tripod for this. This can be used creatively to make water blurry in a photo, implying a sense of motion. To do this, put your camera on a tripod, make the aperture quite small and the ISO very low. This will darken your image, requiring a longer shutter speed. If there's too much light, you can also use a neutral density filter. Taking a longer exposure will make the water look like it's moving in the photo. This technique can also be used on moving subjects to make it look like part of the subject is moving. This would be the case on the propellers of an airplane or a helicopter. If you freeze the propellers on an airplane or a helicopter in the sky, it doesn't look right. It looks like it should fall from the sky. To get it to look more realistic, get some blur in the propellers. It makes it look like there's some motion there. But there's a trick to this technique. We heard earlier that you need high shutter speeds to track fast-moving objects, but we want a slow shutter speed to show some intentional blur in the propellers. How do we do this? We do this by using a slow shutter speed, but using a panning technique. That is a technique to accurately track the movement of the airplane or helicopter so that the body of it looks sharp, but the propellers look like they're moving. And by the way, this technique is very difficult. As you get more proficient, try to lower the shutter speed down to 1/100th of a second or even 1/50th of a second. Don't expect to get every photo sharp. In fact, expect most of them not to be sharp, and if you can get 5 or 10% of them to be sharp, you're doing really, really well. And by the way, this is great technique for photographing flying birds. If you can get sharp photos at 1/50th of a second using good panning technique, then photographing birds at 1/2000th of a second will be a walk in the park. To note, some image stabilization systems on cameras and lenses may actually hurt your panning technique. That's because as you're moving from left to right or right to left, it may try to correct for your movement, but you actually don't want this corrected. This can be solved by using the panning mode or sports mode on lenses that are designed to only correct movement up and down and to not correct movement left and right. This would be mode 2 on Canon cameras. Another creative technique using long shutter speeds is light painting. I use this in my Milky Way photos, and I used it in this photo here. I light painted with a small light the foreground, otherwise it would have been completely dark. It makes for a much better photo, really highlighting some of the patterns in the sand that were there. You do this by setting your camera on a slow shutter speed, and while the shutter is open, walking around with a light and waving it around so that you put some exposure on your dark subject. Note that light painting is best done from the sides of the image so that it creates small shadows and creates contrast in your image. If you light paint from the same field of view as your camera, you'll get no shadows and will look very flat. A variant of this technique would be to have moving lights within the field of view. That will be the case when you use burning steel wool spun around on a string. It makes a beautiful effect. For types of photography where getting the right shutter speed is really important, like sports or wildlife, camera manufacturers have created a mode on your camera where you set the shutter speed and the aperture and the ISO can be set automatically by the camera. That's called TV mode. So in this mode, set your shutter speed to what you need to freeze the action and set your ISO, and the camera will adjust the aperture to make sure your exposure is right. You can also let the camera choose the ISO by putting your ISO on automatic. And I said if you stayed till the end, I'll give you a bonus tip. Here's the shutter speed trick that allowed me to get this photo. The Milky Way moves, so shutter speeds longer than 15 or 20 seconds will actually blur the Milky Way, which is not what you want. But at night, a 15 or 20 second exposure at a dark site will leave the land too dark. The trick here then is to shoot the Milky Way with a 15 or 20 second exposure that will freeze the Milky Way, but to shoot a longer exposure of 2 or 3 minutes for the land and then combine the two halves in Photoshop. And that's the technique I used for these shots. And as a bonus, in this photo, I was able to get the streaks of the cars far below using a 3-minute exposure, and I was also able to get a composition where the streaks of the cars on the road and the path were mirror opposites, making for a great composition. If you're interested in getting into Milky Way photography, I have a whole video on the subject which takes you through taking a photo and processing it from start to finish. I'll link right here. So the next time you go out to shoot some photography, ask yourself this question in every scene. How can I manipulate my shutter speed to make a creative photo? There are a lot more things you can do creatively with shutter speed. I haven't covered them all. What's your favorite? Let me and the viewers know in the comments below. If you thought this video was helpful, give it a like and YouTube will show it to even more people. Go out there and take your own unique, amazing photos. I know you can. See you later.